Hey, my name is Chris, and welcome to Coding in Public. Now, last time we worked in a rather lengthy video on all the HTML and CSS for this page. Right now, what we're going to do is work on the JavaScript so that when we press down on these keyboard arrows, when we click here, when we click on these links, that these buttons, these underlines follow us wherever we go and it jumps to the right section. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Okay, so one thing I need to let you know that I realized I didn't do correctly in the last video, well, it's not like it was wrong, but it'll be easier to do it this way, is I had these as divs before and then was just going to add an event handler that would then basically jump to the right section. But if we just make these links, when we click, they should jump anyhow. And so there's no reason to make this more difficult on ourselves than we need to. But what we do need to do is make sure that we can apply an active class to the one that's been clicked or scrolled to. Same thing up here. We want to apply an active class so that these are bright white, the underlines here for us. If you have questions about how I set up the CSS or the HTML, go ahead and watch that last video. Now we need to do a few things here. We need to grab our query selectors. These are things we're going to use throughout our functions. We're going to write a lot of like helper functions. These are basically making it so we can reference the same function depending if we click or whatever. It'll make that easier for us. And then we need to actually write our intersection observer. And then we need to do an event handler for the keyboard. So let's kind of do these one at a time. We know we need a few things here. We need our navigation bar up here. We need these buttons, and then we need the sections. So let's grab those one at a time. So we'll say sections, and we need query selector all for these. And we're going to grab all the section tags. Okay, second, we need to grab the nav links. So we'll say nav links, I think is what we called those. And we'll say nav links. And then third, we need to grab the nav buttons. What did I call those? Nav button without a dash for some reason. Okay, nav buttons. Okay, and if we wanted to, we could console log each of those and make sure we have them. Let's just do this nav buttons one. Okay, that's working. Perfect. Okay, now what we're going to do is write our intersection observer. I did a series recently on a 3-part series on intersection observers. So if you need a refresher there, you can go back that way. But we will say const, and let's just call this our section watcher. It's going to watch our sections. We'll say new intersection observer, and it needs two things. It needs a callback function, and it needs options. Now we can just call this callback and options. We can call it whatever we want, but to make it a little clearer what this is, we'll say section watcher callback. That'll be the function we're going to write in a moment here, and then section watcher options. Not wection, section. Okay, we'll come in here and let's see. Let's grab this function here, and we'll just write it as an arrow function, and we'll just say console log ya being watched. Okay, and then we need to grab these options because it's yelling at us. Same thing here, except this time it's an options object, and we'll set it to exactly nothing. And now we need to actually call the section watcher on our sections. So let's come up here and let's say sections.for each section. We want to run this section watcher on it. So we say section watcher, and we say .observe, and then we pass it the section that we're going to observe. And then when I save it, we're getting something observer. Oh, it's observe. Okay, you're being watched. You're being watched. Every time I scroll, I'm being watched. Okay, so for each section, we've passed it that. Now, let's come up here, and this callback function that we wrote is going to take two things. It'll take sections, first of all, the ones we're passing into it, and then it will take the actual section watcher. So section watcher as well. Okay, and let's come in here. Let's give ourselves a little bit more space. Okay, and instead of saying you're being watched, let's say sections.for. Let's just call this, yeah, that's going to be confusing with this variable up here. Let's just call it section, I guess, because that's what we said it was passing in. So for each of those that is being passed in, we want to say section if, and here's where we need to actually kind of figure out what we want. Well, let's console log first of all. Let's just console log. So console log the section. Okay, so each of those is being passed in, and then we'll say you're being watched. Okay, so all 5 of these trigger as soon as we refresh the page. And then if we can, let's zoom this out a little bit so you can see what's going on here. Every time I scroll, it's triggering the sections as they leave and enter the page. So let's come in here and let's look at one of these. And we can see we've got a bunch of things in here, but the thing we're interested in is intersecting. Because we've looped through these, we actually are getting, what we can do is here is just say dot is intersecting. Okay, and then you see false, 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 but one of them is true. All right, just this drone one. And then if I move up, you see as I move, the ones that leave the page say false, the ones that enter say true. So what we need to know is if this section that we're looking at, that it's observing, is intersecting the page. So let's come out over here and say if it is not intersecting, first of all. If it's not intersecting, let's get rid of it. We don't need that. So if it's not intersecting, let's just return. We could do this on 2 lines. We'll just do it on 1 here. Okay, let's see. I've messed this whole thing up. So let's come in here and say, let's remove this. This parentheses go here. Okay, there we go. Okay, so here's what's happening. If it's not intersecting, it's not doing anything. So we're only getting you being watched. So now what we're getting is basically only every time something starts to enter the page, not when it leaves the page. And that's how we want it to work. Now, every time that something is active, we want to both add an active class to the nav bar and to these buttons. So let's call this up here. We can write it, I guess we'll just write it as an arrow function. So active section handler is what we'll call it. And we'll just say it's going to pass it the current section ID is actually what we want it to pass it. And we're just naming it that to remind ourselves what's going on. So let's use this action section handler. We're going to come down here and let's console log again, just so we can remember what we're getting here, this section. Oh, and I forgot that this was not a traditional function. So let's see, there we go. Okay, so we're going to console log back here, just the section. Okay, so only the section that is intersecting. And you can see both of those were, so that's why we got both of those. Now you might notice something here. As soon as I scroll at all, it triggers the other one, so that if any part of it is showing, it's triggering it. That's what these watcher options are for. So we'll come in here and say threshold, and we're going to set this to 0.5, which means half of the thing has to be on the screen for it to trigger. So as we move up, once half of it's on, there it goes. Now it triggers. Okay, so that's what we want so that it doesn't actually say we're live on the page if we're at least not halfway on. We could change that, I guess, maybe to like 0.6, make it even a little bit more, and then it will trigger. Okay, and it's actually giving us that whole section. Now out of this, what we want is we want to pass on the section ID. So we come in here, it's in this proto, or in this target. Here we go, in this target and ID inside here. So if we scroll all the way down here, ID. All right, so there's a ton of stuff in here, but what we want to pass is the section.target.id. And that gives us computer, drone, computer, watch, camera. Okay. So let's bring this up here. And what we want to do is we want to say, switch this out for action section active is what that should say. Active section, man, I really messed that one up. Handler, and let's change this to be the same thing. And then we'll just say console.log current section ID. Now remember, that's whatever we pass in here. This argument is what this parameter references. And so it should do the exact same thing we were just doing below, except now it's doing it with this helper function. So what we want to do now is loop through those links and double check that they actually correspond to the data attribute we added. You might remember we have on each of these data dash section, that's a custom attribute. We named it whatever we wanted. You can add your own attributes as long as you add data dash before it. So what we can do is we can say nav links. Well, first of all, why do I have all these curly brackets? All right, nav links dot for each link. We want to, let's just console.log the link. So for right now, it's just going to give us all of our links, one after the other. These are our things. Now, this one, we named the same thing, but we're not going to worry about that because we're going to write an if statement to kick out anything that isn't a link that corresponds to the current section. So let's come in here and we're going to say link.dataset dot whatever the name of the dataset is, which is section. So now one of them is going to be undefined. That's the actual kind of main nav. We probably should have a different class, but and then all these are going to show. Now what we want to know is if this link.dataset.section is equal to the current section ID that we've pulled in. So we'll say if link.dataset.section is equal to the current selection ID, then go ahead and say link.classlist.add, and we want to add that active class. And so you see that's exactly what it does. It pulls that up there. That's the active one. This is the active one. Now here's the problem. As they get active, they never get unactive. So what we actually need to do is below this if statement, we need to actually write something here that will remove that active class. So we'll come in here and say remove, and here it is, and you see as we move, they've removed. But the problem is what we actually want to do is still add to the one inside here. So let's return out of here if we've hit this active one. So we'll come in here, and as we switch, it is going to go ahead and just show us this active for this class and then jump out of this whole loop at that point. And this essentially acts like an if-else clause, except we don't have to worry about the kind of messiness of nesting all that. Now the nice thing is for our buttons, we're going to do the exact same thing. So we'll come in here and say nav link, and this was buttons. And for each, and let's just name these buttons. I guess we could keep them linked, but that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So we'll say for each button, do the same thing. And notice, once again, they show as we click, up here, and that's perfect. And as we scroll, they automatically update as well, which is awesome. And that's what we want to happen. Now there's one more thing we need to do, because what would be really cool is be able to just hit our down arrow or up arrow and actually jump sections rather than just kind of slowly move up the page like this. We can do that by adding an event handler for the keyboard. So we'll actually watch on the entire window, and we'll say add event listener, and we're looking this time for a key down event. And we're going to get from that an event. Let's just call it key because that's what it is. And we're going to say this. Let's go ahead and console.log the key itself. So whatever we press should show up in the console over here. I press the up arrow and look at all this stuff we get in the keyboard event. We get if there's an alternate key that was pressed with it, if all these kinds of things. This code for arrow up, we'll use that in a moment, I think. Key code tells us the key code, the unique key code here. Key, same thing as arrow up. I'm not sure what the difference between code and arrow key is, and key is because they look like they're the same thing. I'm sure there's a difference. We won't track that down right now. So anyhow, we get all this kind of stuff. What we're interested in is this key.code. So let's do that, or I guess it's key code. And let's console log that, and I'm going to press the up arrow, and I get 38. I press the down arrow, and I get 40. Any other keys, I'm getting all these other keys in here too. So that's the way we can figure it out. I press the up arrow, 38, down arrow, 40. So key.keycode is what we need. And what we want to do is we want to only really pay attention to those two. So let's just write two if statements here. Let's just say if key.keycode equals, and you might remember 38 was that up, then we're going to say console.log you pressed up. Then let's come down here and say if it equals 40, that was the down, we'll say you pressed down. And otherwise, we will just return. So up, down, and nothing else does anything. I mean, it interacts like it normally would, but it doesn't console log anything for us. Okay, so now what we want to do is let's actually use these, and we're going to say if it's either 38 or 40, let's call another function. So let's call a function, and let's call it key event handler. And we're going to pass it the key.code, which was the name of the key. We could also pass it this, but I don't want to remember what the key code is. Arrow up, arrow down, whatever. We could also, I guess, come in here. Maybe let's do this. Let's just say key code, and I think that was arrow up. Let's try that. Let's say you pressed up. Was it arrow up? Yeah, you pressed up. Okay, and then this one would be arrow down. Nothing else should have those two, so that should work just fine. So key code. Now let's come back here again and say key event handler, and then we will key event handler, and we will pass it the key.code. All right, so we'll pass it either arrow up or arrow down. Same thing here. Okay, so if either of these things happen, we're going to run this key event handler. Now we haven't written that yet, so let's come up this way and let's go back to our helper functions. And let's say const. Why is this capitalized? All right, let's come down here and change this. We should start these with lowercase. Okay, and what we're going to do here is take in that key code that we were given. We call it whatever we want, but we'll call it key code because that's what it is. Let's see, this is an arrow function, and we'll just say console log the key code. Okay, so this should say arrow up or arrow down. Nothing else should show. So left, right doesn't do anything. Up shows arrow up, down shows arrow down. Okay, perfect. That's what we want. Now this is a perfect use case for a switch statement. But what we do is we can basically say, hey, here are a bunch of different options you might be presented with, and here's what we want you to do. We're going to run the switch on this key code that gets passed in. And there's two options that could get passed in here. If the case, in other words, one option is arrow up, then here's what we want you to do. We'll just say console.log up. All right, because now we know we pressed up. And then we will break from this, and we'll do the same thing here for arrow down. Except here we will say down. We do need a default, which shouldn't be possible. So let's just say console log, how did you get past my if statement? Okay, because that shouldn't be possible, because the only two things that should come into this key event handler are arrows up or arrow down. So I come back over here, press up, key code is not defined. Oh, I capitalized this. Key code. Press up, and that gives me up, down gives me down. Nothing else does anything for me, just those two things. You may have noticed when I'm pressing up and down, it's actually still moving up and down. We don't want it to do that. So let's actually prevent the default before we ever pass it to our helper function. So we'll just say key.prevent default. This means it won't do the normal thing, which in this case would be arrow down, and in this case would be arrow up. Now, if we come over here and press up and down, it does absolutely nothing but send our key code to the handler, and the handler just console logs up or down. Now we need to do a couple of things here. We need to know which section is the active section, and we need to be able to update that every time it changes. And then we need to basically figure out what the section, the actual whole ID, what the next element ID is. So if it's watch or if it's camera or whatever it happens to be, we want to figure out what that is and move left or up or down based off of that. So let's write another helper function that'll help us do that. And in order to access the variable we're going to create in there or update in there, we need to declare it out here because it's going to be changing depending on the section. Let's create it as a let variable, and we'll just call it active section. And now let's come down this way. Let's see, let's do it right here. And this will set our active section. So we'll say function. I don't know why this is a function and the rest of them are arrow functions, so let's keep it the same, I guess. We'll say active, how about set active section? And we're going to pass this in from the event handler. We're going to pass in the section from there. So we'll say active section equals section dot target, the thing that gets passed in dot target. So we're just going to pass in this event handler here. Oh, and I forgot again that I made this a arrow function. So there we go. So we're going to pass in the set active section down in our observer. So we'll come in here and say set active section. We're going to pass in the section itself. I guess we could pass in section.target. And then what we can do is come up here and just call the section instead. Okay, so now as we move, that should change. And let's go ahead and console log this here. So console log the active section. So that's the actual section, that's the active section. Okay, and it changes as we update. Perfect. Okay, so that's our little really tiny helper function. Let's just put this all in one line. No reason to take up more room than we need to with it. Okay, now what we want to do is figure out what the next element sibling is next to that whenever we use this arrow up. So let's call a function that we're going to write called show previous section. Okay, and this will be another arrow function, if I can remember that it's an arrow function when I write it. And we're going to say, let's grab the active section dot previous element sibling. And let's go ahead and just actually console log this. So when I come over here and I press up, it should give me the one above, which is this camera. And that's what I want. Now, if I come up to the camera and I press up, what do you think is going to happen? There's nothing above it. It's going to give me null. So we need to actually kind of run a check to figure out if this is equal to null. And if it is, to return to get out of the statement. So we'll say if active section.previous element sibling is equal to null, then go ahead and return out of the function completely. Actually, let's go ahead and set this to a variable. We'll just call this const previous section. And then in here, we can just reference previous section so that we can also reference it below, because we're going to say previous section. In other words, if it's not null, if there is something above it, then go ahead and say previous section, and then we're going to use this method called scroll into view. All right, and this is just native to JavaScript here. And so what I can do is come down here and click up, and it scrolls it into view. And if I get to the top and I press it, nothing happens because we've already returned out of this statement because it equals null. Now the cool thing is here, all we have to do is to say show next section, and then let's call this next section and next element sibling and next and next. And then come down here and we can just call this show next element section. Now we come in here, we press down, it jumps down like this. Press up, it goes up. Pretty cool. All right, and as we click, it jumps here as well. Now you may have noticed these things are kind of like animating through all of them. And that's actually nothing to do with JavaScript. It has everything to do with the scroll behavior we have set on the actual body and the HTML. We've set it to scroll behavior smooth. That way when you click any of these anchor links, it slowly, smoothly jumps up. Now, if I were to remove this and then do it again, and I jump to drone, it just jumps immediately to that section. Now, some people actually prefer this, and they may turn on either on their machine or with some kind of plugin on the web. They may say, hey, I don't want any motion. I want to reduce motion. Well, for those people, you want to respect that. So let's make sure you add a scroll behavior initial. And if you don't want that, you can just, that's the default. The default is basically, I don't remember what it's called, none, something like that. Or auto, I think is what it's called, scroll behavior auto. And so if you don't want it to kind of slide through those, you can just set that to auto, and that's fine as well. But now we've got it to where we set it up where when we move this, it jumps kind of section by section. I'll zoom in a little bit more here, and then when we click, you see those jump, this updates, we move, that updates, we hit the arrow keyboards up and down, that updates as well. So we have officially completed the project. Hopefully that was fun. The process of actually thinking through all this, JavaScript, and thinking through, okay, what do I need, what to do, where, when, how, that itself is actually, I think, the most helpful thing in this project. Well, if you like this kind of thing, please subscribe. That helps me a lot. Get some more viewers, and will encourage me to keep posting this kind of content. So thanks so much, and happy coding.